So, how exactly do you take a bunch of seemingly random news stories and weave them into one powerful political narrative? Well, today we're going to do something interesting. We're going to deconstruct a single edition of a newsletter called Coffee and COVID to see precisely how it's done. We're going to break down how it pulls together totally separate events to tell a very, very specific story. All right, let's get into it. Right from the jump, the very first line, the tone is completely set. You can see this isn't framed as just a neutral summary of the day's events. Nope, it's assertive, it's optimistic. Everything that's about to follow is framed as great news. And that tells you we're not just getting headlines, we're getting a story with a crystal clear point of view. A story the author breaks down into two main parts, Crooks and Cooks. So the first big theme that the source starts to build is this idea of a new era of accountability. It makes the case that officials, who it labels the crooks, are finally facing a reckoning. And it builds this case using some very specific examples. And here's the first piece of evidence it lays out, a formal Department of Justice investigation. The allegation that DC police have been, cooking the books on their crime statistics. The newsletter immediately links this to a recent New York Times article that admitted Democrats have a crime problem. The suggestion here is that the Times was just trying to get out ahead of a much bigger, much more damaging story that was about to break. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. It's all about how the source uses history to make its point. It straight up acknowledges, hey, this isn't a new issue, and it even brings up a past scandal from the 1990s. But it does this for a very specific reason, to argue that this time, things are fundamentally different. And here's exactly how it makes that case. It draws this direct comparison. See, on the left, you've got the old scandals, where it points out that a single whistleblower often ended up punished while the officials themselves faced no real consequences. But on the right, for today's investigation, the source highlights that the whistleblower isn't just one person, it's the entire police union. That contrast is used to signal a huge shift in the power dynamic, implying a much, much more serious outcome is coming this time. Okay, so from police corruption in DC, the narrative pivots. It moves to the second pillar of its accountability theme, alleged financial misconduct by high-profile Democrats. And just like that, the Crooks theme expands from a local city issue to the highest levels of the federal financial system. So the source clusters these three prominent figures together, right? All of them are accused of the same kind of mortgage fraud, which is related to their primary residence. By linking them like this, it moves past just individual allegations and starts to suggest a pattern of behavior, a systemic problem among a certain political class. And this is the crucial part, really. It's all about how the source frames this entire thing. It explicitly says, look, this isn't about political revenge. No. Instead, it's presented as this necessary, almost brave act of dismantling a two-tiered justice system. The point it's making is that a single standard is finally being applied to everyone, no matter how powerful they are. All right, let's move on and see how this all builds into the second part of the story. Using a little wordplay, the newsletter shifts from the crooks to the cooks. The argument here is that because of everything we just saw, the Democratic Party's goose is, well, cooked. And to make this argument, the author pulls from a very strategic source, the New York Times itself. See, by using a pillar of the mainstream, traditionally left-leaning media, to anchor its argument about Democratic decline, the newsletter gives its claims a massive dose of credibility with its readers. It's basically saying, hey, don't just take my word for it, look at what their own side is admitting. In this right here, this is the data at the very heart of the Cooks narrative. The newsletter highlights these numbers from the article, showing Democrats losing over 2 million registered voters, while Republicans gained almost 2.5 million. You do the math, that's a net swing of 4.5 million voters in just 4 years. The source doesn't just call it a shift, it calls it a stampede. It frames it as nothing less than a political counter-revolution. So you might be wondering, why is this 4.5 million number so significant? Well, to explain that, the source introduces this concept, the preference cascade. The argument is that these voter registration numbers are just a lagging indicator. They represent the moment the dam finally breaks, when millions of people who are maybe privately unhappy suddenly feel safe enough to publicly switch sides. And that, in theory, could trigger an even faster, bigger political shift. But a theory is just a theory. To give this abstract concept a real emotional punch, the newsletter then dives right into the comment section of that very same New York Times article. It uses the words of the paper's own readers to show the real-world impact of this political shift. The first quote it pulls speaks to this deep sense of betrayal. The source uses this comment, where a reader literally says they feel orphaned, to suggest that the party's base feels completely abandoned by the very institutions they used to trust for guidance. And that feeling of being abandoned is followed up by this sense of just total confusion. This second quote highlights the argument that without a clear narrative from their traditional allies, readers are just left feeling stunned and totally directionless when they see bad news. So you've got this decline in voters, a decline in morale, and then the narrative connects it directly to the financial consequences. By showing this massive reported cash advantage for Republicans, the source argues that this isn't just one problem. It's a comprehensive one, affecting votes, enthusiasm, and now the critical resources you need to actually compete. And now we get to the big finish. The author uses a classic technique here, a rapid-fire lightning round of what seem like disconnected stories. The goal isn't a deep analysis of each one, but to create this feeling of overwhelming, unstoppable momentum. So the newsletter just lists them out, one after the other, and presents each one as another win. There's a political victory in Texas, then a new task force to look into C-19 vaccine problems, then an announced overhaul of intelligence agencies, and finally, it argues that old narratives against its allies are fraying while legal challenges are getting thrown out. By weaving all of these together, it creates this final cascade of proof points, all hammering home that central thesis. And it all ends with this short, punchy, almost cinematic line. Ruh-oh, reckoning's inbound. It's the perfect summary of the entire narrative that has been so carefully built throughout the piece. A day of reckoning isn't just possible, it's already on its way. So when you step back and look at the whole thing, what's the big takeaway here? Well, this edition of Coffee and COVID is a masterclass in narrative construction. It took a dozen different stories, a DOJ investigation, mortgage applications, voter data, reader comments, and it strategically wove them into a single, unified story, accountability for the crooks and an inevitable decline for the cooks. And that really leaves us with a critical question to think about. Whether you agree with this particular narrative or not, it's a powerful reminder of how the media we all consume is actively constructing reality. It doesn't just report facts, it arranges those facts into stories. And understanding how those stories get built is probably the first step to thinking critically about the world they're presenting to us. Thanks for watching.